And so the years go on, the economy grows, the financial sector expands to be vast and powerful. These gold receipts proliferate, with private paper becoming a major currency. At the same time, however, wars expand, and internal disputes between Catholics and Protestants reach a boiling point. And as many of the new rising financier class, including many quite prominent figures tied with continental finance, Protestant noblemen, and those in the Parliament who wished to assert more power, would all agree that the Stuart dynasty no longer served them, King James II would be deposed, with the Protestant Dutch William of Orange being brought in alongside his wife, Queen Mary. The new monarchs who had been placed on the throne would find themselves much more subject to the Parliament and the financiers than their predecessors. Under the new Glorious Revolution regime, powerful financiers from the Netherlands would be brought in to become part of England's ruling class. The English Bill of Rights would be enshrined, enshrining rights of Englishmen and the Parliament, giving the Parliament much greater political stature over the Crown. And the new regime and economic apparatus would come to look much more continental and Protestant. Yet as warfare expanded, England's financing needs would outstrip its tax regime, and so prominent politicians, noblemen, and financiers would get together. The Crown would make an offer to the financiers if a consortium of wealthy investors would agree to aggregate £1.2 million in gold and silver to directly lend to the Crown. Then they would be granted a royal charter to form a joint stock company with monopoly rights over the creation of banknotes. The financiers would agree, making the loan to the Crown. In turn, a new company would be created, and a royal charter and monopoly would be given to the Bank of England. The original investors in the Bank of England would include King William and Queen Mary, as well as many prominent noblemen and financiers, including Sir John Holbein, who would become the first governor of the bank, and later Lord Mayor of the City of London. Many of the new integrated financiers from the continent, some of them noblemen, would as well become major investors. And so now England had found a new financing capacity. This monopoly would lend to the Crown, paying in gold and silver to be repaid in gold and silver. With this government debt as backing, the Bank of England would issue banknotes, and thus the national debt had been monetized. And with the monopoly given to the bank, England's new currency system would be paper Bank of England notes backed up by government debt, itself backed by the ability of the government to collect taxes. England's base money was still gold and silver, yet now it had a monetary banknote system backed by the power of tax collection. And so this financial class would accrue vast power, increasingly making up the ranks of not only the wealthiest in the kingdom, but the nobility itself. The Crown and government would gain the ability to borrow at a capacity that they never had before, and so both England's economic might and its military might expanded rapidly. The year is 1711. It's a generation later, and you are a wealthy London merchant, though now you're a bit more of a financier. Business is booming, and it seems as though everyone around you has gotten fabulously wealthy. However, as you are well aware, the finances of the kingdom are in disarray. In order to pay for the enormous War of Spanish Succession, the government had gone deep into debt, as these debts had been made with different investors, different consortiums, and all at different times under different circumstances. These debts had different interest rates, different repayment schedules. The debt situation had become a real mess. And so, facing this predicament, the Lord Treasurer had gathered together a group of some of the best financial minds in London. Your friend is one of these such financiers, and one evening he's telling you all about the meeting he had. He explains that the government is facing £9 million in unfunded floating war debt, and that he and the financiers were tasked with figuring out a way to consolidate all of this debt together. Excitedly, he tells you all about their stroke of genius. The government will create a new joint stock company. Everyone who owns England's debt obligations will be made to trade in their IOUs and receive shares in the company. You ask him why anyone would want shares in this company. He tells you that the government promises a 6% dividend to be funded by customs duties. And so now, instead of dealing with all of these different debt issues, all of the borrowers will be paid back in the dividends from this company. You listen, but this doesn't seem that interesting to you. If anything, it seems like a bit of a ripoff for some of the investors. But that's when he smirks. He tells you he's on to something big. He explains that this company will be given a total monopoly on all British trade in Spanish America. Now this piques your interest. You ask him more about it. Ask him if there's any way that you can get your hand on some of those shares. He tells you yes, and that if you're interested, then that can certainly be arranged. You smirk and lean back. You have found what you think is the best business venture ever. So you ask him, what's the name of this company? Ah, the South Sea Company. And so, the government has innovated a debt for equity swap. The debt holders trade in their IOUs and receive shares in the company. And everything seems to be going pretty well. You're a savvy investor with some very good connections, and so you get in on the ground floor. The years go on and the war ends, yet you begin looking into the trade in Spanish America, and you come to find that Spain is heavily taxing and restricting English trade. You begin to worry. The 6% dividend was nice, but you were really interested in that monopoly, all that untapped trade. But it's beginning to look like that trade might not really be there. And so, as you examine more closely, you begin to wonder if this monopoly is hollow. Yet you're a major investor. You really can't sell that easily. And so, meeting with your friend again, he suggests that you join the company as a director. That way you could get more insight, and you could have some say over the direction that the company goes. And so you join on. You discuss your concerns with the other directors, and after careful deliberation, you come to a sensible business decision. Why not just manipulate the stock? And so you do. And now, under the careful fiduciary stewardship of the directors, the shareholders thrive. Because you know that the shareholders don't really care about the business, they care about the stock. And in a flash of absolute genius, you have come to realize that the two are not the same thing. Years pass, and the government is once again in a bit of a pickle with its finances. They decide to outsource the rest of the national debt. Upon meeting with the other directors of the South Sea Company, you decide to bid on the debt. You win, outbidding the Bank of England, all because you carefully considered the finances and made a very smart, sensible business decision. And not that it really matters, but you did also bribe the king's mistress. And so, in April of 1720, the South Sea Bill is passed. The company takes over $31 million in remaining national debt. The holders of government annuities are encouraged to exchange them for South Sea Company stock. And so, you issue more stock. In the spring of that year, you and the directors realize how great your business is. It's clear to you that more people would want to invest in the company if they could. If only there were more company for people to invest in. And so, after carefully talking it over, you and the other directors agree to offer more stock to the public, and on generous terms. You will provide loans, 10% down, and interest-free. You look around and smile at yourselves. This is a very clever idea. You put yourself in the shoes of an investor. After having may or may not eaten breakfast that morning, this hypothetical investor has the opportunity to get a 10% down, zero-interest loan issued by the South Sea Company to buy South Sea Company shares, a loan which can be collateralized by South Sea Company shares. Excitedly, you look to the other directors. Just imagine it, the company giving you free money to buy the company, all backed up by shares of the company. You know, the company that is giving loans so that people can buy shares of the company, backed up by the company, issuing shares of the company, backed up by the company, issuing shares of the company, backed up by the company, issuing shares. And after you have run through this a few times, The other directors nod.
Very good, very good, very good. Yes.
And so, as your leverage loop enters the market, your shares explode. Over the course of 1720, South Sea Company shares rise from £120 in January to 1,000 in June. Months pass and you are very pleased with yourself, for you have turned your magnificent fortune into a staggeringly magnificent fortune. Yet one day, as you walk past the stock traders, something bothers you. You are hearing orders for other companies. You wonder why anyone would want shares in another company, not when there's the company. And so you learn that as such large gains have been made in South Sea Company shares, copycat companies have entered into the market. Well, you can't have this. They're draining away liquidity from you. And so you speak with some members of parliament who you know. You explain the situation. Well, surely we can't have people investing in other companies. Just think about what could happen to investors if they invested in some sort of unscrupulous company that didn't have a real monopoly. Probably they're doing something like pumping up their own stock. It would be awful for investors to get tricked into investing in something like that. No, they should only invest in the company. The very wise politicians see it your way. And that year, they pass the Bubble Act, banning all unchartered joint stock companies. You thank your friends in Parliament, telling them to keep up the good work, keeping honest men from unscrupulous financial swindles. And so once again, as the only company that matters, issuing loans to people to buy shares of your company, backed up by shares of your company, you continue to make it big in the market. You strut around feeling quite pleased with yourself. Yet one day, upon speaking with your friend, he seems a little bit more concerned than usual. You ask him what is wrong, and he explains that after all of those copycat companies left the market, he and some of his friends have been looking over the numbers. If those companies could be gone in a day, then is the South Sea Company really as great as it seems? He shows you the numbers, explaining that some of the best financiers in London and Amsterdam are looking at this. Upon looking through his math, it seems as though the company is wildly overvalued and could never possibly live up to investor expectations. This seems absurd to you. You've done everything that a good businessman should do. You've issued cheap loans so that the unsophisticated public could buy your stock. You've done the politician thing. And so as you sit with your friend, you realize that you are in a bubble. Oh. And so quietly, you and your friends, the other sophisticated investors, all begin selling shares, keeping it very quiet and out of the public's view so nobody gets spooked. And then it happens. Shares of the South Sea Company begin to crash. In only a matter of months, the momentum collapses and shares go from £800 back down to £125. Many investors are entirely wiped out, for not only were people putting enormous investments into these shares, but many had done so with enormous leverage. Yet to make it worse, many banks across England had accepted South Sea Company stock as collateral, and so they were wiped out as well. As a result, there was a massive credit freeze across London, and so the great South Sea Company was reduced to dust. Yet the years go on and England moves forward. It's a time of growth, a time of expansion into new territories, into new markets, and in new ways of thinking. Your economy booms, and London becomes one of the most central hubs of global finance. A new dynasty ascends to the throne, and the Kingdom of Great Britain is formed. Over these years, British explorers, merchants, settlers, colonists, businessmen, financiers, and so many with their eyes to new horizons spread out across the world, building up new societies, building up enormous businesses, and developing a vast commercial and financial network. The British Empire is rising, and with it too, the merchant bankers of London are becoming among the most powerful men in the world. Yet too, with all this change, the 18th century would see substantial philosophical shifts. People were beginning to think about new ways of living. New ideas on the relationship between state and people would arise. Europeans were increasingly becoming liberal, adopting the ideas of the Enlightenment. As these changes would escalate, along with them would come jarring political changes. Some of Britain's North American colonies would secede, forming into a new nation. And meanwhile, on the continent, a more French variant of these liberal ideas was beginning to draw ire against the Bourbon monarchy. This, in turn, would lead to revolution. The Bourbon monarchy would be decapitated. Figuratively, I mean. And the Bourbon monarchy would also be literally decapitated, as would many other people, as the French Revolution would spiral out of control. Yet ultimately, the new French Republic would return to some semblance of stability, and as the 19th century would near, a new French leader would arise, rebuilding France from a war-torn and chaotic failed state into a vast, militarily powerful juggernaut. Back in Britain, the designs of the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte would come into conflict with the needs and strategy of Britain's empire. And so, as Europe entered into the 19th century, enormous wars would rage across Europe, with a coalition of European nations standing against the great power of the French Empire. Britain's armies would be skilled, its leaders quite competent, and its technology and resources remarkable. Yet what would truly allow Britain to stand against Napoleon's armies wouldn't be its military nor supplies per se, but its ability to finance its needs. With the sheer financing power of the Bank of England, Britain would be able to finance itself in a way that the French could not. However, as the Napoleonic Wars raged, panic would begin to boil up in Britain. Many would begin to hoard gold, and so, realizing the situation, prominent financiers and politicians in London would get together. If the Bank of England had to pay depositors in gold, then in this environment it would surely drain its vaults. This simply couldn't be allowed to happen, not while war with Napoleon was underway. And so a new predicament had formed. The Bank of England's monetary system was based on gold, and yet, in order to finance the war, the Bank of England needed its gold. So how do you simultaneously have a system based on the promise that you will pay out gold, and also not pay out gold? The top financial minds put their heads together, and they came up with a solution that was really clever. What if they just don't? And so, they didn't. After all, it was only temporary. This was just an emergency measure for the war. Things would go back to normal once old Boney was pushed back to Froggyland. And so, as the Parliament suspended the bank's obligation to pay out gold, a new monetary system had been born, and thus began the first Fiat experiment. In the new system, the currency was the Bank of England note, and base money was the Bank of England note. The Bank of England note would be backed by state credit. State credit which the markets trusted because of Trust Us. And so once again imagine yourself to be in this same lineage of financiers. As you and your family have become quite important, you have secured a meeting with the governor of the Bank of England. Concerned by the passage of this bill and the new monetary system, you ask him to explain what this all means. He tells you it's really quite simple. The government sells debt to the Bank of England. The Bank of England will issue receipts, Bank of England notes, notes backed up by government debt. Here, the Bank of England has monetized the government's debt. These receipts for debt, the Bank of England notes, go into the commercial banks, thereby entering the economy as currency. Once these Bank of England notes are in the economy, the government is able to collect taxes. Taxes to be paid in the Bank of England notes. He smiles at you, thinking that this is very clever and quite sound. And so you think about this. So, the government goes into debt, which the Bank of England buys, issuing receipts for the debt. Those receipts being currency, which are used to pay the government so that the government can pay back its debt in receipts for its debt. He nods.
Clever, isn't it?
So the government goes into debt promising to pay back receipts for its debt so that the bank can turn the government's debt into receipts for the debt to go into the economy so that there can be receipts for the debt for the government to tax so that it can pay the debt.
Yes, quite.
You think about this a little deeper. There's just something about it that's nagging you. So, the government issues debt to the bank, so the bank can issue receipts for the debt, so the government can collect taxes in receipts for the debt, to pay the bank in receipts for the debt to be paid in receipts for the debt, so that the bank can issue receipts for the debt, so that the government can collect taxes in receipts for that debt, to pay the bank in receipts for its debt to be paid in receipts for the debt, so that the bank can issue receipts for the debt, so that the government can collect taxes on receipts for the debt?
Yes,
He tells you. Well, why would they do that? So that they can pay the bank in receipts for the debt to be paid in receipts for the debt. You think about this. Why would anyone trust that? He raises an eyebrow. Well, who would distrust the government and the bankers? You think. That makes sense to me. With the raw power of this new system, Britain was able to financially overpower France. For Britain had created the perpetual debt and tax system, a system where the currency is based on debt, debt to be repaid in the currency based on the debt, to be repaid in the currency based on the debt. This made sense to everyone. And so, as war rages in the continent, you have now found yourself in a perpetual debt and tax system. In such a system, money is based on the government's debt issues, and therefore, as the economy expands and the financing needs grow, in order for the money supply to expand, there must be more government debt. This in turn requires more taxes, taxes which must be paid in banknotes backed by government debt. And so the government must always be in debt, going deeper and deeper to expand the monetary base, and the citizenry must constantly be taxed. The debt perpetual, the tax perpetual. Yet ultimately the years pass, and the war ends. Eventually the gold standard is reinstated, and as the 19th century goes on, European empires sprawl across the world. The financial empires spread out, building intricate networks of debt, commerce, and influence. And the banking class, with the ability to create credit, the ability to set financing terms, and the ability to manipulate derivatives, become the dominant class in Europe. Their commercial networks become an empire unto themselves, with vast commercial enterprises spreading across the world, taking control of the world's resources, and in turn, the world's peoples and land. As the territorial empires of Europe expand, in turn they must call upon the bankers to finance large infrastructure projects. The landed nobility simply can't keep up. Many of them are bankrupt, destroyed, or are absorbed into the new banker lords. The 19th century empires of Europe are at the highest level, financial. Over these years, industry booms. The largely agrarian societies of Europe find their landscapes changing rapidly. People who had lived in close-knit towns for centuries found that they had to go into crowded, cold, impersonal, mechanical, industrial cities, forming a new industrial labor class. Yet as the economy is expanding rapidly, Britain finds itself plagued by frequent financial panics. As the Bank of England had lost its monopoly over the creation of notes, several smaller banks had frequently been overissuing their own paper notes, leading to speculative bubbles. So once again, the political and financial minds of the realm got together. In 1844, the Bank Charter Act would be passed by Parliament. They figured that in order to ensure long-term price stability, they must give the Bank of England a strict monopoly on note issuance and tie the volume of said notes to the exact gold supply they had in their vaults. Britain was now on a strict gold standard. Silver, however, was another matter. Owing to the scale of the tea trade in China, Britain had found itself with a continual outflow of silver. Under Britain's mercantile model, this was unacceptable. They needed to keep the silver in. Yet, unlike other empires like the Spanish, they had no means by which to maintain their silver supply. And so the financiers of Britain came up with a novel solution. First, they began to sell large quantities of opium into China, building vast commercial networks, as well as destroying the lives of many Chinese. Yet, beyond that, these financiers came to realize that what was important wasn't strictly maintaining a supply of silver and having inflows, but instead was having control over the flow of silver, having say over how and where it moved. And so as these financial empires rose to become so powerful, the derivatives market became the basis of control over silver, and increasingly other commodities. If one could short silver, forcing its price lower, or use the power of credit creation to manipulate the futures curve, then without ever touching a single ounce, London could maintain control over the metal. All seemed to be quite well. London was getting fabulously wealthy, and the banker lords were becoming dominant over the planet. With the gold standard reinstated, it seemed as though there would be financial stability. However, this decision would backfire, as when panics would hit, banks could no longer print emergency money. The Bank Charter Act would be suspended in 1847, 1857, and 1866. During these periods, the Bank of England would act as the lender of last resort, printing unbacked notes to save the failing commercial banks. Now, with the bank being given this new special role, it had transitioned into something new. The Bank of England was now a central bank, the bank of the banks. The 19th century would be a period of enormous prosperity for Britain. The London financiers, with power over credit, would control increasingly vast empires of resources, all while the Bank of England would act as the bank to the bankers. Entering into the 20th century, it seemed as though this period of prosperity would continue. However, as Europe entered into the 1910s, a series of crises would emerge. The empire that had once maintained stability in the East, the Ottomans, found itself increasingly weak. Tensions in the Balkans would arise, and it seemed as though many of the Eastern powers of Europe were being drawn into a political crisis. Meanwhile, currency shocks would hit the London bankers, and as Britain's imperial policy was bringing it into contact with Russia, it seemed as though the financial crisis, the Eastern crisis, and balance of power disputes in the West, with respect to the unified German Empire, were all pointing to war. The First World War would require total economic mobilization. In order to finance the war, Britain would borrow enormous quantities from the bankers of New York. The merchant bankers of London would as well act as a consortium for state debt. Yet, in order to pay for the enormous transactions of supplies and munitions internationally, Britain found that it needed very large amounts of gold. The top banker lords of London and the political elite would meet, with figures like Lord Nathaniel Rothschild, the Lord Lieutenant of Buckinghamshire, playing quite prominent roles in the financial decision-making of the empire. It would be decided that Britain would pull gold from the public, replacing the gold that was in use with treasury notes. Thus, domestic gold convertibility would be ended once again. The base money supply in Britain would be banknotes, notes backed by government debt, and the Bank of England reserves. Britain had returned to a fiat system, and yet it was increasingly becoming evident that the finances of London were becoming inextricably linked to the United States. For across the Atlantic Ocean, while Europe found itself dragged into a brutal war, the world's credit was increasingly being issued by New York, and the United States was becoming a financial giant.